So I'm going to get just a little bit wonky today because I've just spent the last couple hours looking at different research, again, trying to seek out any evidence at all that critical race theory, anti-racist, internalized racial superiority, whatever you want to call it, that those types of trainings are actually effective in the workplace. And of course, I didn't find any of that, but I wanted to use one specific article that I found to illustrate to you how to break down and question academic research, because at least in the land of YouTube, there are an awful lot of people who are citing an awful lot of journal studies that really, frankly, shouldn't be applied in the way that they are asserting that they should be. And they sound really smart, and they say, this study happened in the journal of blah, 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 and it means XYZ. And most of the time they're wrong. Most of the time it doesn't mean that at all, but they're applying it in ways that is frankly not applicable for the purpose of sounding more intelligent than they actually are. And so I wanted to give you some resources to be able to ask questions when these types of things come up. Now, this video is a special shout out and dedication to Brandon Strock, Mikey Harlow, and Blair White, because this weekend they're actually headed down to Fort Lauderdale, and I'm going to be there too. I'm going to be sitting in the audience. I don't have to do a dang thing, but they're going to be headed down to do the Walkaway LGBT debate, where the three of them are going to be debating three people on the left, and hopefully they can have actually a civil discussion. But I promised Mikey was very concerned. He was like, I want to know how to counter any studies they might bring up, because Mikey is really into like policy and all this stuff. And so I promised him, I was like, I'm going to give you questions that you can ask them about the different studies that they're bringing up, and hopefully come to some more common understanding of what those studies actually say, or at the very least, you're going to catch them in a gotcha moment, probably good enough when we're in the context of a debate. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to look at this one specific article, and I'm going to show you an interaction on Twitter that I had with one of the authors of this article to prove my point emphatically. And then I'm going to go through 5 questions that you can ask about any academic research just to get more context around what that research actually says, because it's a little tricky, but really not much. Once you know these questions, you're going to be able to question any academic paper that happens to come across as someone asserting this is the end-all be-all paper that's going to prove my point on anything, and very rarely do they actually do that. But before we get into that, folks, I need your help. I've got a goal of trying to hit 100,000 subscribers by Election Day. I'm absolutely on track to do it. But if you've watched a couple of my videos, maybe you haven't subscribed yet, I hope you'll consider hitting that little red subscribe button somewhere down there, subscribing to the channel, turning on notifications, all that good stuff. And remember, if you think you're subscribed, just go ahead and double check that, because YouTube may have pulled some shenanigans. All right. So this paper I randomly found today on Twitter when I was doing research for other things. And so this was published. It was a featured topic in diversity and the workplace. This was published in a journal, Behavioral Science and Policy, which all sounds well and good. It looks really nice. It's called Developing and Delivering Effective Anti-Bias Training Challenges and Recommendations. And so we're not going to read the paper. Don't worry, I'm not going to read you this whole paper. I don't think my voice would hold up today. But I am just going to go through some broad points to give this video some context. So you're going to see in the abstract. Now, the abstract is the thing that is supposed to set up the entire paper. It's basically supposed to repeat in a couple of sentences what the entire flipping paper says. This abstract says, in this article, we will review the relevant evidence, noting that training should be explicitly aimed at increasing awareness and concern about bias, while at the same time providing strategies that attendees can use to change that behavior. Now, based on that one sentence, would you think that this paper is going to be a list of strategies that are backed up by research and evidence? You might think that because they have used the word evidence and they have used the word strategies, but that is not what this paper is. What this paper is essentially a literature review going through different research that exists in the field. Of course, the authors of this paper have handpicked this research that fits whatever, because here's one of the things I learned from my dissertation mentor, like very early on. It was one of the most helpful things he ever told me. He said, Carlin, You can always justify a point you want to make. You just need to find research to help you justify it. And there is research about everything under the sun, and it's on both sides, every possible side you could think of. You just need to find it. And that is exactly what this paper has done. This paper has taken research. It's talked about research that exists out there. It's been selective about the type of research that includes, and it has created recommendations based on that pre-existing research. But this paper did not do any research into the recommendations that it offers. It didn't go out and test those in the field. And so I can prove that too. You can see in each of these highlighted sections, and again, I'll link to this paper so you guys can go read it. You can go check for yourselves, because really, dude, always check what I'm saying. I always link to my resources down in the description. But you can see in this, what they're doing is they're citing academic research. They're citing a meta-analysis of 260 studies, blah, 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 blah. And they're making recommendations based on other people's research. This person, they cited research from someone else. They've got other people's research here. And listen, man, there is not a thing wrong with citing other people's research. There's nothing wrong with that at all. In fact, most academic papers do. They do things called a literature review to be able to go in and study the topic that they're thinking about studying, and then they provide an outline of the research that they considered and different points of view and different perspectives. So there's nothing wrong with that inherently. But where I think this paper goes wrong is it talks about challenges and it talks about recommendations, and I really want to go down here to the conclusion. Because I've done some other videos about academic research, just like here and there, so you may not have seen them. A trick that I always use with papers is I read the abstract, and then I go down and I read the conclusion. And if those two things are interesting to me, then I'll go in and I'll dig into the research and I try to figure out how they did the research. And if those things are not interesting to me, I'm like, okay, on to the next, whatever. It's like a little shortcut, because if you spent all day reading academic papers, you would probably very literally go insane. And so I just want to read you the first section of the conclusion here. It says, the recommendations in this article should guide the next decade and beyond of anti-bias training. Now, that is a lofty thing to assert when you've done no research based on the recommendations. And you know how I know they did no research based on the recommendations that they offered here? Well, guess what, folks? I asked one of the authors of the paper myself. So let me just go back to this little interaction I had with Neil. And listen, man, I don't have any problem with Neil. I don't know Neil. I've never talked to Neil. We actually had a pretty cordial interaction. I mean, I was actually probably the one that was uppity in the interaction. Neil was just fine. He was very polite. So I have no ill will towards Neil. I'm sure he's a nice guy. I'm sure he's trying to do a good job. He's an assistant professor at Cornell, which probably explains a lot, but I don't actually hold that against him. Listen, I genuinely mean this. If we agree that higher education indoctrinates people into a very specific train of thought, that can I hold that against everyone that's gone through that, especially like the Ivy Leagues, man? These people don't stand a chance most of the time. Like, I was so lucky. I was this close to going to an Ivy League school, and then I decided not to. Thank God every day for that. That's a long story. I'll tell you guys another story another time. But so what I specifically asked Neil here, as he was talking about his paper, he says, we've identified FOB-RIDE challenges that hinder trainings, proposed some recommendations to address those challenges, and discuss which agents within the organization may be best suited for implementing these recommendations. Now, I responded with, what specific data were those recommendations based on? Because I've read the paper and there's no evidence or data to show that you've applied and evaluated the effectiveness of your ideas. So Neil and I had two different goals with this. Neil wanted to do a literature review, basically looking at existing research, and then make recommendations based off the existing research without actually testing the efficacy of those recommendations. So they made recommendations based on previous literature, but they didn't then go out in the field and say, okay, let's try these and let's just make sure they work before we literally write a paper asserting that our recommendation should be taken as the basis for anti-bias training for the next decade. So we have two different philosophies there. And my philosophy has always been about what works in the real world. So he replied back, he says, the data is in the papers we cited. It's a review paper synthesizing and translating research done on the topics. And I said, and he's right. That's exactly what it is. It is a review paper. It's a literature review. And I replied, I've read the paper. You did not provide data to show you had directly applied the recommendations you made and assess the outcomes of those recommendations. You cited other people's research as the basis for the recommendations. It's not the freaking same thing. And then I responded back further And this is the difference, guys. This is the difference between what gets written in academic papers and what ends up actually being applied in the real world. Here's what I would like to see. We think these recommendations will work. Here's an example of us applying our own recommendations. Here's the outcome of that. Here's what we got right. Here's what we got wrong. And here's our next iteration based on that direct application. And he responded and he said, well, I understand that you wish we had written that paper. We had written a different paper presenting the data and not the scope and goal of this paper. So he's basically saying, no, we didn't actually try our recommendations. And this is where the rubber starts to meet the road, because you've got to be really specific about what these papers say. And then I did what I tend to do, which is I pointed out in a retweet just to be a little bit uppity because, again, like, I'm sorry, these people should be held accountable. This paper literally says the recommendations in this article should guide the next decade of, let me see, I actually have a better quote down here. Should guide the next decade and beyond of anti-bias training. That is literally in the paper, but these recommendations were not directly applied in the real world. So really, there is no data and evidence that the recommendations they made actually have that efficacy. All right. So this is an example where just a few simple questions, you take a paper that seems to say one thing and can be very easily be cited by someone like Vosh to say, here is an academic paper that has been peer-reviewed in a journal, and here is what this says about what is going to work in the real world. And now we know, based on just a few simple questions, that paper is not actually that paper hasn't been applied in the real world. We have no idea if those recommendations work in the real world. And I want to say too, and I think I need to offer this because, listen, I can S-post on Twitter all day. I can be snarky about things, whatever. But when it comes to research, you really do need to keep more of an open mind. And so I even offered on Twitter, I said, listen, I keep an open mind. Maybe they work, maybe they don't. I would love to see a direct application and analysis of your specific recommendations, but you haven't done that. And that is exactly the flipping point. That is exactly the point. Very rarely do any of these papers actually end up being applied in the real world. And that's why we have no data or evidence to support the idea that critical race theory actually works. It is just not existent. So we can ask just a few simple questions to start to assess when someone presents us with research, does this actually work in the real world? Now, I'm going to give you my top 5. I'm going to give you my top 5 of questions that I like to ask just to kind of get a basis for what we're actually looking at. So again, this is going to get a little wonky. I'm going to be talking about my dissertation and how I applied this in my dissertation, because really I never wanted to do academic research. So I was like the only thing I've ever done. It took 2 years of my life. It nearly killed me. But that is the context that I have here, is the mentorship that I did with my dissertation advisors, actually executing on a dissertation and having to read a whole metric F-ton of academic research in order to make that possible. So anytime you're presented with an academic paper or study, the very first thing you want to know is what is the methodology? How is that data collected? Now, there are 2 broad types of studies that can be done. The first is a quantitative study. This is where we're looking at like surveys or polls. They tend to have a larger sample size. You're going to have basically a lot of statistics. When it comes to quantitative studies, the sample size tends to be larger, which means a larger sample size tends to have a broader applicability. However, something that holds quantitative studies back along a lot of the time is that they tell you what happened, but they are not clear on the why. If anyone does a quantitative study, and again, anything involving statistics or 75% of the people said this and 86% of the people said that, anytime you have that, you're usually looking at a quantitative study, which is going to tell you what happened, but it's not going to tell you why it happened. And that is a very important distinction. Now, researchers can kind of take a best guess about why what happened, but their data is not going to tell them that. That's simply not how it's collected. Qualitative studies, on the other hand, and I'm a qualitative researcher, I like stories, I like those scary lived experiences. Qualitative studies do tend to provide more context around general themes and they can tend to get at the why. Now, I know if I say the term lived experiences, a lot of you you want to run away, scream no, Carlin, don't talk about lived experiences. I'm not talking about it in the same way that the SJWs do, guys. There is actually a valid way to do qualitative research to assess what is the lived experience of something, but it's not the same thing as a random person on the street going, well, this is my lived experience, so you have to take it seriously. That's not what it is. Qualitative research, when it's done correctly, actually involves a lot of in-depth data analysis. It really does. And you have to keep going back and reassessing. And it is really labor intensive. It is arduous to do. It's not just about talking to people off the street. You have to find different themes. You have to keep interviewing people. You basically have to keep interviewing people that fit the inclusion-exclusion criteria for your study until you stop seeing new themes manifest. So it really does take a long time, and it's hard, and it's not the same as how a lot of them position it. Now, what you need to know for this, though, is that qualitative studies do tend to have smaller sample sizes. So with quantitative studies, a lot of times, and this is the same with presidential polling, you'll always see, if you look at the poll numbers, you can see that they're going to be around 1,100, 1,200, 1,300, stuff like that. And people always say, well, how can you possibly know based on 1,100 people what the answer is? Well, you can know that because once you reach about 1,100, 1,200 people, your margin of error tends to go down quite significantly, and tends to adding more people to the study is not going to significantly decrease your margin of error at that point. That's when you get around to a plus or minus 3 margin of error. So it can be more broadly applicable because adding more people to the study is not going to significantly reduce that margin of error. Qualitative studies are a little bit different. Qualitative studies tend to have much smaller sample sizes because of just the nature of the study. So in the type of research I do, you're going to be looking at anywhere from 8 to 14 people in a sample, which sounds really small, but I'm going to explain that in a second. 8 to 14 people, maybe 20 at the outside. But the thing of it is that you are not supposed to be able to necessarily apply the qualitative research to a broader population. That's not the intent of the research. Qualitative research basically gives you insight into specific themes, specific phenomena that are happening, and what it tends to do is it sets the basis for more quantitative research to follow it. So research, and we're going to talk about this, research never ends, right? And the purpose of contributing to the academic field of study is not only to study a really, really specific topic and to set up further research so you're contributing to creating a broader understanding of what's going on, but it's not ever meant to be the end all be all. So don't let it fool you. With qualitative studies, those lived experience studies, you are going to have a smaller sample size, but you have to be really honest about what is the applicability. In my dissertation, I talked to 8 people. 8 people. I believe it was 8 people. It's been a while. I did 8 different interviews. I kept analyzing the data throughout the interview process. So I didn't just collect all the data and then analyze it at once. I would do an interview. I would analyze it. I would identify different themes. And I would do the next interview, identify different themes, refine the themes, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. Now, I kept interviewing people until I stopped identifying new themes. And it just happened for me. Thank God, because this, again, my study nearly killed me. It was about workplace bullying. It sucked to research. I had to hear a lot of bad stories. But it just ended at 8, and that was just the way it was. And I had the research I needed at that point, so I didn't need to add any more to it. Now, is that the definitive number for everyone? No. Is my study broadly applicable to everyone? No, absolutely not. And I write about that in the study, which is another component that we're going to talk about in a bit. So that's the first question that you want to ask. What is the methodology? How is the data collected? Now, you might hear when you're doing different methodologies, you're going to probably hear more specific things. My study was not a general qualitative study. My study was actually a grounded theory study, which is a very specific type of research. And you can always ask more questions about, what does that mean if you don't understand it? Moving on, number 2 question that you want to ask when people are presenting you with an academic study in the course of a debate. What is the inclusion-exclusion criteria? Now, this is deceptively simple, right? Inclusion criteria are basically the criteria that you lay out ahead of time for what people are going to participate in your study. Exclusion criteria are criteria that you outline ahead of time for what people can't participate in your study. What attributes might people have that would exclude them from being part of the population that you study? Now, this might seem simple, but it really can give you a lot of insight into how the study can be broadly applied. So, for example, my dissertation research was a grounded theory study of young professionals coping with being the target of workplace bullying. And so I had a number of different inclusion criteria. They had to be a young professional, which I specifically defined as 35 or younger when the bullying happened. They had to have been a target of workplace bullying. So I had to have them fill out a survey to basically assess if they were actually a target of workplace bullying, what that bullying looked like, and they had to do that in order to be considered for inclusion in my study. There were some other attributes too. Now, one of the important exclusion criteria that is relevant is that the bullying, if I had a person and they were a young professional and they had been a target of workplace bullying, one of the exclusion criteria attributes was that that bullying had to have been over at least 6 months ago. So if they had experienced the bullying within the last 6 months, they were not allowed to be in my study. And that was not so much about the study as it was about protecting the mental health of the participants, because bullying is a very traumatic thing for a lot of people. And so you don't want to talk to them about the bullying right the second that it gets over. You want to give them some time. I came up with that time frame by consulting with other experts in the field, yada, yada, whatever. But the limitation of that I then have to offer, because we have to offer limitations, which we're going to talk about in a second, was that, okay, well, the people in my study, they're going to be remembering back to something that happened at least 6 months ago. And so we're going to work on their best guess of their recollection. You know, they're doing it in hindsight, and you're not going to get the same type of data based on someone's hindsight recollection that you're going to get if they were talking about it in the moment. So that is a very distinct limitation of my study that I have to offer, because that's just the way it is. In order to be ethical about this, I had to make sure that I had time between when the bullying occurred and when I talked to them about it, because that was the ethically sound thing to do. I also had to offer that based on that exclusion criteria, that there were distinct limitations to the study. Okay, so there, we've already just uncovered one limitation to my study that I could absolutely be called out on in the context of a debate. Moving on. Did the study challenge its own confirmation bias? Okay, so there is a very specific process to research, right? Usually what researchers are supposed to do when they're being honest is they come up with an idea, they come up with the idea for what they want to research based on reviewing the literature or observing different phenomenons, and then they do a literature review and they kind of think about, what do I expect to happen? What do I expect the outcome of this to be? Now, you have to write that down before you actually do the flipping research. At least that's the way I had to do it when I did my dissertation. One of the first things I had to write down, and this was before I even started talking to a damn person, I had to say, what were the expected outcomes of my paper? I had to kind of pontificate of, okay, based on the literature, here is what I expect the outcome to be. And then I go do the research, and then when I did the conclusions, I had to assess, okay, how did the conclusions differ for what the outcomes were that I expected? Now, that was all written in my dissertation. And then, you know, you'll see academic papers, some of them do this, a lot of them don't. They follow the same process. They say at the beginning, here is where the expected outcomes of our study, and then they kind of go back and reassess at the end. Oh, here's what we got right, here's what we got wrong. Now, in the context of academia, where, again, the goal should be the pursuit of the truth, that's perfectly fine. It's perfectly fine to say, you know, guess what? We did a best guess at the beginning of this and we didn't get everything right. But that usually doesn't tend to come out in a debate. So you kind of have to ask people, you know, did they talk about their expected findings? Did they were their actual findings different than their expected findings? You can ask these probing questions to get people to really assess, frankly, if they've actually read the flipping study. Because if they haven't read the study, they're not going to be able to answer that question. And you know, if they haven't read the study, then you can follow up with like, have you read the study? Because this is a pretty standard part of academia. You're supposed to talk about what you expect to happen, and then you're supposed to go out back and evaluate after you do the study, did it actually happen? So did you really read the paper? Was this discussed in the paper? You can kind of paint them into a little corner in that respect. Now, another thing that researchers do, again, if they're behaving ethically, which they are not always doing, especially in the realm of gender studies, is a lot of times researchers will actually talk about their own bias in the paper. This tends to be more applicable for qualitative research because qualitative research is much more subjective in how you're assessing the data. But when I did my dissertation, I had to write a whole section about what my own biases were. I had to write about the fact that while I was completing the study about workplace bullying, I was actually working for a boss who was a horrible bully, and this may have impacted how I perceived the study. I had to offer that. Okay, so most papers, well, maybe not most, some papers, when they come out in journals, they might have a section talking about the researcher's own bias. That doesn't necessarily mean the study is bad. It doesn't mean the study is bad, but they have to offer that ethically. And so you want to be sure to question, like, did the researchers have any bias? Did the researchers talk about any of their biases? How do you think their biases impacted the conclusions they drew in the study? All right, I know this video is going a little bit long, but I've got a lot of stuff I want to talk about. Okay, number 4, what are the limitations of applicability? So, no study, whether it is qualitative or quantitative, there is not a single study that exists out there that is applicable in every single setting. It just doesn't happen. And the applicability of it is going to be largely based on what is that inclusion and exclusion criteria and what is the sample size. So what researchers have to do when they're doing their discussion, when they're doing their conclusions, they have to talk about what populations this study is going to be applicable towards. If they're not doing that, then they're not behaving ethically in the frame of presenting their research. I'm sorry, I mean, maybe that's not like 100% true, but it's true a lot of the time. And this is especially true when I'm looking at things like papers that are saying, oh, this paper should be used for the next 10 years to inform anti-bias training. Well, what is the applicability of that paper? Because they haven't talked about the type of organization, they haven't talked about the size of the organization, they haven't talked about the people that demographic attributes of the people receiving the training. They haven't talked about the follow-up. They haven't even tested their ideas. So how could they possibly be making the statement that this is applicable to the next 10 years of anti-bias training in the workplace? It just makes no sense. So papers generally do need to offer, this is where this research can be applied. Now, they can also do things like leading to our next question, because these two components kind of overlap, is what is recommended next? What are the limitations of this research? Where should the research go from here? What are recommendations for next studies that you want to do or that you want to see other people do? Because like research, again, it's never over. The body of research will never be complete. It is an ongoing process. And so what a lot of researchers have to do within their papers is to say, here's what I would like to see study next. Here are the limitations of the study. Here are the holes we still have. They're supposed to proactively be offering those things. And oftentimes that will overlap with the limitations of applicability of the study. Now, if I had to pick a question, if someone in the context of a debate were offering me, this person researched this thing and it was published in this journal and blah, 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 blah. If I had to pick one question to start with, it's probably going to be, what are the limitations of applicability? And if they don't want to answer that, I'd go back to this one, because this is a rudimentary question. What are the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the study? What is the, maybe you could go to what is methodology, because that's going to inform it as well. But if you're talking about the applicability of a study in the real world, I want to know what the population is that was studied. I want to know the sample size. Again, keeping in mind that that sample size is going to be different based on whether or not this was a qualitative or quantitative study, and that's perfectly okay. But once you know what kind of study it is, once you know what the inclusion-exclusion criteria is, that's already going to give you some hints about the limitations of applicability. So, for example, I know I'm skipping around here, but I'm doing this on the fly. I don't script things out. You guys know that. So, for example, if you find out in the course of questioning people about this study that this was a qualitative study, well, that is not broadly generalizable to the broad population. It's simply not. Not even if you know the inclusion-exclusion criteria. So, for example, with my study about young professionals being the target of workplace bullying and how they coped with it, I had a list of young professionals, but I also had to say clearly, this doesn't necessarily apply to all young professionals. This happened to be the case for this very limited audience that I interviewed for this study, and more research is needed to know whether it does apply to the broader population. And I have to offer that as someone that's trying to be ethical about the type of research I wanted to do, okay? If they're not offering that, then this research is like, you can shoot so many holes in it, just like we did with that paper at the beginning. But if you focus on the limitations of the research, that's oftentimes going to be enough to trip people up, because frankly, most people haven't read the damn studies and don't really know how to apply them. All right, guys, I've been talking for about half an hour. I hope that's helpful. Mikey, I hope that's helpful. I promised you I would give you some tips and tricks. I think that the Walkaway LGB Town Hall is going to be live streamed, so make sure you tune in if you can't make it in person. And yeah, that's all I've got for today. I'll see you guys soon.